2025 was an absurdly strong year for movies. There were so many films I really loved, from Sentimental Value and Marty Supreme to Hamnet and Begonia. But the best picture, as it currently seems, will be a two-horse race between two other phenomenal films. Ryan Coogler's Sinners and Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. And honestly, if you ask me on a purely cinephile level, One Battle After Another might actually be my favorite choice between the two, which is why you might wonder why I still believe it shouldn't win Best Picture at this year's Academy Awards. One Battle After Another might actually be the best film of 2025. But I think Sinners should win Best Picture. And if One Battle should win Best Picture, it would actually be ridiculously ironic and go against the film's own messaging. Important disclaimer: this is not an anti-PTA video, quite the opposite actually. Paul Thomas Anderson is and has been my favorite director for years now, and on a personal level, I would absolutely love to see him finally sweep the Oscars. And this is also not some charity argument or me saying politics should matter more than art. If anything, what makes this conversation interesting is that both films are really genuinely extraordinary. Both would be worthy winners. But if the question is not just which film do I like more, and instead which win would actually mean more, culturally, symbolically, historically, then I think the answer gets more complicated. Because One Battle After Another is, among many other things, a film about the limits of white allyship. And if that particular film, with that particular message, wins Best Picture over Sinners, a film that speaks much more directly from lived Black experience, then the Academy would almost end up reenacting the exact contradiction the movie itself is already pointing at. To explain what I mean, I think you first have to admit that this is actually a really hard call, because these two films are both operating at an extremely high level. One Battle is this huge, politically charged, tonally insane film from a major author working with total confidence. It's ridiculously funny, opera-esque at times, messy on purpose, and formally just breathtaking. It has scale, ambition, uniqueness, density. It's one of those movies where you can feel a filmmaker with decades of experience just trusting his instincts and making something only he could have made. And again, PTA is my guy, so this is not me trying to diminish what he pulled off here, not at all. But at the same time, Sinners is not only some politically relevant film that simply deserves points for being culturally relevant, it's also simply an incredible piece of cinema. It has cultural weight, yes, but it also has meticulous craft across the board, masterful genre bending, emotional force, and an impressive formal control. It's one of those rare times in which a film entered the culture immediately upon its release. So when I say One Battle After Another maybe shouldn't win Best Picture over Sinners, I'm not saying it because One Battle somehow isn't as good. I'm saying it precisely because both films are so strong that the distinction starts to become less about quality in the abstract and more about what kind of victory each one would represent. And that's where perspective starts to matter. One Battle is clearly a political film. It deals with immigration, state violence carried out by ICE, fascism, resistance, the failures of the left, and the limits of white allyship. It has real urgency, but it still does all of that largely through a white perspective. A white auteur, a mostly white production context, and a giant white movie star at the emotional center of the film, even if the film is actively critiquing and decentering that figure being Bob. Sinners feels fundamentally different in that regard. It also deals with racial oppression, but contrary to One Battle, it speaks from a much more directly lived Black experience. It speaks directly from the experience of the oppressed themselves. It doesn't just comment or interpret cultural exploitation from the outside looking in. It embodies that experience from within. There's a difference between telling a story story about oppression from the outside and telling a story about oppression from inside the communities most shaped by it, most affected by it. There's a difference between political interpretation and political embodiment. And once you start looking at the Oscar race through that lens, the comparison gets way more interesting. This is where the irony really kicks in, because One Battle itself seems to understand that distinction. One Battle After Another is not a white savior story. If anything, it keeps undermining that possibility at every turn. Bob, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, the main character of One Battle After Another, is not the one who changes the political landscape. He's not the competent revolutionary hero. He's not the one who rescues everyone through courage or clarity. He's a fuck-up. He's clumsy, paranoid, overdramatic, chaotic, smokes his brains away, often is kind of clueless and useless. And the film knows it. That's part of what makes the film's satire so sharp. The film understands the limits of the white ally figure instead of pretending he can still be the center of liberation. In fact, one of the most interesting things about One Battle is that it actively decenters its white protagonist. The people who actually carry moral clarity, practical competence, and a more sustainable political energy are not Bob. Willa, his daughter, is stronger and more competent than him. Sensei is also more grounded and more competent than him. Even the film's final messaging is that Bob learns that his role is not to be the revolutionary messiah, but simply to be a father who raised someone better than himself, someone who can actually make a difference. So if you take the film on its own terms, what it's ultimately saying is that struggles against oppression are not actually led by the white guy who means well. White allies can support, amplify, care, stand beside, but they cannot substitute the people whose lives are directly shaped by those structures. The white allies cannot substitute the voice of the oppressed. And if that's what the film understands, then imagine the institutional irony of what it would mean for the Academy to turn around and say,
Yes, exactly. And therefore, we will now center this film, One Battle After Another, above sinners.
That would be pure irony. A film about the limits of white allyship winning over a film created much more directly from within Black lived experience would almost feel like a live-action reenactment of One Battle After Another's own critique. The Academy would basically prove the film right. Life imitates art. That's what makes this conversation more than just which movie is better. It's about the symbolic logic of the win itself. Because One Battle is skeptical of spectacle, skeptical of performative self-mythologizing, skeptical of the white protagonist being mistaken for the revolution. So if Hollywood still takes that film and elevates it over Sinners, then it's not just rewarding a great movie, it's accidentally recentering the exact kind of perspective the film itself is trying to criticize. And that's why this isn't just a neat irony, it would reveal something about how these institutions still work. Hollywood has a very long history of rewarding exactly this kind of thing, not necessarily out of malice, more out of comfort, because the industry loves politically conscious films as long as they arrive in a form that still feels understandable to a wide audience. And One Battle After Another, for all its creative brilliance and political bite, still fits that description in a certain way. It might be radical as a film, one could argue, but for the Academy, it's still a relatively safe kind of radical. A major white author, a giant white movie star, a prestige package, a politically urgent subject, and a film that allows people in power to feel like they are recognizing something daring without actually shifting the center very much. I would call this safe progressivism. Hollywood often seems much more comfortable rewarding films that interpret oppression than films that emerge directly from it. It likes ally narratives, it likes films that say, look,
We understand the problem. We are on your side. We get it.
Because that kind of recognition allows the institution to congratulate itself. It creates the feeling of moral seriousness without necessarily redistributing attention in a deeper way. And that's where Sinners becomes the more symbolically meaningful choice. Because if Sinners won, it would not just be the Academy saying we care about oppression or we care about political art. It would be saying that a story shaped from within those lived realities gets to be centered for once earning the complete spotlight. It's not just admired, it's not just nominated, but centered. That matters. Not because awards are sacred, but because they still function as a cultural signal. They help define which stories get remembered as the story of the year, which voices get framed as universal, which film becomes the one that future audiences look back on and say, this was what mattered. So yes, sure, the Oscars are just awards. They are not objective truth. They are not a perfect measure of value by any means. But symbolism is not nothing. And if the Academy chooses one battle after another over Sinners, it would risk feeling like one more example of an overwhelmingly white institution preferring politically aware white mediation over voices speaking from much closer to the wound itself. That doesn't make one battle less great. It just makes the choice feel very familiar. And that's why for me, a Sinners win would simply mean more. Not because it needs pity, not because it would be some kind of corrective charity prize, and not because one battle is somehow less accomplished as a film. This is really important to me. Sinners would not be a more meaningful winner because of the cultural impact only. It would be a more meaningful winner because it would have a big cultural impact, and on top of that is an incredible film deserving to win Best Picture. I mean, honestly, at least half of the films of the Best Picture category this year would be deserving winners to me when we go by quality. But only one of those films is truly a voice of minorities, a voice of the oppressed, while also simultaneously being a high-quality film. It's not some morally worthy runner-up that we should reward to make ourselves feel better. It's also just a staggering piece of cinema. A great piece of art. I mean, it broke the Oscar nominations record in a very strong year for cinema. That is no small feat. It blends genre, it carries history inside its body, it transforms exploitation and cultural appropriation into myth and feeling without losing specificity. It doesn't just comment on those realities, it embodies them, as I said. It turns them into cinema from within. And that's ultimately the key difference I keep coming back to. One battle after another interprets and comments on political struggle, while Sinners embodies that struggle. Again, that does not mean one battle is shallow. It's one of the smartest films of the year. But there is still a difference between a film that is reflecting on oppression from a politically self-aware white perspective and an equally intelligent film that emerges more directly from the communities historically shaped by those structures. And if both films are this good, if we are genuinely talking about two masterpieces in different registers, then the symbolic weight of the win becomes the most interesting part of the conversation. Because a Sinner's victory would feel less like the industry rewarding itself for getting the message, and more like an actual shift in what kinds of stories it is willing to place at the center of the culture. And I think ultimately that's the main point, being the center of the culture. That institutions acknowledge that the white ally, in this case One Battle, should not be the driving force, the dominant voice in the fight against oppression, but instead the oppressed themselves, in this case Sinners. Sinners winning would break the usual pattern, where politically conscious white mediation gets elevated because it's radical enough to feel serious, but still familiar enough to feel safe. It would be a win that says these voices are not a side category, not a parallel lane, not a special kind of cinema that we admire while still handing the biggest prize to the more institutionally comfortable option. They are the center this time. And I think that matters, especially because One Battle After Another itself is in some ways already about that decentering. It already understands that the white ally figure is not the revolution. Bob's role is not to save the world. His role is smaller, humbler, and in some ways more honest, to help raise someone who might do better than he did. So if Sinners were to win, it would almost feel like the cultural version of that same lesson landing properly.